My dear students, in this class, let us learn about hormonal action. Hormones are the chemicals that are secreted by the endocrine glands and they are responsible for maintenance of homeostasis and they trigger many metabolic activities within the cell. There are two types of hormones. One set of hormones is called hydrophilic hormones that are water soluble and another set of hormones is called lipophilic hormones. These two different types of hormones will exhibit different mechanisms to influence the target cell. The organ on which the hormone acts is known as target organ. Hormones are essential in maintaining homeostasis. They are involved in many feedback mechanisms. Hormones exert their influence by stimulating or inhibiting the target cells. These are also called regulators. That means the target organs are influenced by the hormones. And I told that there are two types of hormones, namely water soluble hormones and lipid soluble hormones. And these two sets of hormones differ in their mechanism of action. There are specific proteins present in the target tissue that bind to hormones, and these are called hormone receptors. So, hormone receptors means special or specific proteins present in the target tissue. And these receptors may be bound to the membranes sometimes, and some receptors are found in the intracellular environment. That means some receptor proteins are bound to the plasma membrane or they may be an integral part of plasma membrane and some other receptors may be found within the nucleus. Like that, membrane bound receptors and the intracellular receptors are the two types of receptor proteins that are present in different target organs. Membrane bound receptors are present in cell membrane. Intracellular receptors are present in the nucleus and hence they are also known as nuclear receptors. So now water soluble hormones and lipid soluble hormones will bind to the membrane receptors and nuclear receptors respectively and they exert influence on the target organs. Especially hydrophilic hormones for their action requires one secondary messenger called cyclic AMP, whereas lipid soluble hormones they don't require cyclic AMP for their action. Receptor proteins exhibit hormone specificity. Receptor proteins bind to hormones and they form hormone receptor complex. Hormone receptor complex generates biochemical changes in the target tissues. Now let us see the action of water soluble hormones. Water soluble hormones are called hydrophilic hormones. Best example for this is epinephrine. And we know that epinephrine is an emergency hormone which makes you ready to face any sort of emergency. And in this case, in the case of emergency, that means when the emergency arises, there should be greater production of glucose. So now the epinephrine will influence the target organ in such a manner that it can synthesize glucose in extra quantities so that the entire organism will be ready to face the emergency condition. Now let us see how this water soluble hormone, namely epinephrine, will work. I made it very clear that the hydrophilic hormones require one secondary messenger, namely cyclic AMP, for their action. And these hydrophilic hormones bind to membrane bound receptors. Now let us see the action of epinephrine first. Hormones, these are, of course, epinephrine is a hydrophilic hormone. Now we will see how it gets bound to the membrane receptor. And after binding to the membrane receptor, cyclic AMP is generated with the help of one enzyme called adenylate cyclase. Now, epinephrine binds to cell membrane receptor and now this receptor is nothing but a G protein of cell membrane and now this activates adenylate cyclase enzyme which is responsible for the production of cyclic AMP. This cyclic AMP activates protein kinase A. Protein kinase A. Protein kinase A activates phosphorylase. The phosphorylase converts glycogen to glucose 6 phosphate. Now, this glucose 6 phosphate in turn generates glucose. Like that, epinephrine triggers the synthesis of glucose by cascade of reactions. That means epinephrine is required only in nanograms, but this epinephrine, after getting bound to membrane receptor, it is influencing the generation of cyclic AMP, and in turn cyclic AMP triggers other reactions. This cyclic AMP is called a signaling molecule. So this is very, very important dimension of this entire hormonal mechanism. Cyclic AMP acts as a signaling molecule which triggers the cascade of reactions. Now, let us see the entire stepwise reaction. Again, let us try to revise. Let me repeat. Let us go to the next slide. Epinephrine is able to induce glucogenesis. Glucogenesis means production of glucose in liver cells by cascading action of CAMP. What I told is epinephrine is a hydrophilic hormone that binds to a membrane protein receptor, namely G protein, which in turn stimulates guanosine triphosphate and which activates adenylate cyclase, and adenylate cyclase generates cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP is a signaling molecule, that is, it is a secondary messenger which stimulates protein kinase A. Protein kinase A stimulates phosphorylase. Phosphorylase converts glycogen into glucose 6 phosphate, and glucose 6 phosphate is ultimately converted into glucose by glucose 6 phosphatase enzyme, leading to the production of glucose. Thus, epinephrine through CAMP, through cyclic AMP, triggers the cascade of reactions so that the target organ in emergency condition will produce greater quantities of glucose to face this exigency or emergency. Let us see the stepwise manner. Epinephrine hormone is released and it is attached to membrane receptor, namely G protein, which binds to GTP, and now this GTP activates adenylate cyclase, which is responsible for the synthesis of CAMP, which in turn, that means the CAMP activates phosphorylase, and the phosphorylase enzyme converts glycogen into glucose 6 phosphate, and this glucose 6 phosphate is in turn transformed into glucose by glucose 6 phosphatase enzyme. So this is how certain hormones like epinephrine, which are hydrophilic hormones, work through cyclic AMP mechanism. Now let us see the other type of hormone, namely steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble hormones and they bind to internal receptors. Of course, a best example for lipid soluble hormone is aldosterone, and the mechanism by which the lipid soluble hormones work is known as mobile receptor mechanism. Let me explain. So previously, in previous epinephrine case, I told that epinephrine is a hydrophilic hormone which acts via cyclic AMP. Whereas in case of lipid soluble hormone mechanism, no cyclic AMP is required. They directly enter into a cell and also into the nucleus, and they bind to DNA. So this entire mechanism is called mobile receptor mechanism, and aldosterone passes through cell membrane and it has entered into the cell, and it is bound to intracellular protein receptors, forming aldosterone receptor complex. And now after entering into the nucleus, this binds to DNA at specific part, and this specific part produces specific messenger RNA, and this specific messenger RNA contains triplet code which produces specific protein in response to aldosterone. That means now aldosterone, being a lipid soluble hormone, doesn't require any cyclic AMP. It directly enters into the cell and gets bound to the intracellular protein receptor, and after entering into the nucleus it is binding to DNA at a specific site. Like that, specific mRNA is produced, and this specific mRNA with specific triplet code produces the specific protein in response to aldosterone. So this is how the steroid hormones work. So like that, there are two types of hormonal mechanisms, namely hydrophilic hormones acts through cyclic AMP, that is a signaling molecule, whereas lipid soluble hormones act through mobile receptor mechanism. So this is about the hormonal mechanism in relation to hydrophilic hormones and lipid soluble hormones. Thank you very much.